This is the story of Nathan Brooks and his wife, Elena Voss. They had built something real together. A home with good light in the mornings, a marriage that functioned like a well-maintained machine, dependable and quiet. But somewhere between the third and fourth year, the machine had started running on memory rather than fuel, each of them performing the version of themselves the other had married without checking whether that version still fit. Nathan carried his anger the way some men carry debt, privately with great discipline, until the weight became architectural, part of how he stood and moved through rooms. Elena loved him in the specific, exhausting way that people love things they believe they can fix, if only they approach the problem correctly. The tension between them was not loud. It was the kind that settles into furniture, into the pauses before answering simple questions, into the particular way a person can sleep beside someone and still feel the distance measured in inches. This is a story about what happens when one person decides to save something quietly and the other mistakes that silence for abandonment. The coffee maker had been broken for 11 days. Nathan knew this because he had been the one to break it, not intentionally, but with the particular carelessness of a man who grabbed the carafe too hard on a Tuesday morning when the day had already started wrong before it started. The glass had made a sound more like a statement than a break, and Elena had come to the kitchen doorway in her robe, looked at the pieces on the tile floor, and said nothing. She had ordered a replacement by noon. The new one arrived on the Thursday. She placed it on the counter without comment, and Nathan had felt, for a reason he couldn't name, that the efficiency of her response was worse than an argument would have been. This was their 5th year of marriage. They had met at a work conference in Portland, Elena presenting a paper on organizational behavior, Nathan sitting in the back row trying not to look like he was watching her instead of the slides. He had been 31, recently made a project manager at a mid-size engineering firm, and possessed of a confidence that, in those early years, looked identical to steadiness. Elena had been 30, sharp in the way that some women are sharp, not aggressively, but with a precision that made you want to be more careful with your words around her. They had married after 2 years. The first 2 years of the marriage had been genuinely good. The kind of good that people mean when they say they were happy, when they can actually point to specific afternoons as evidence. The problems, when they came slowly. Nathan's anger had always been there, dormant and contained, the way a fault line is always there beneath a city that has never had a significant earthquake. He was not a man who shouted or threw things. He was a man who went cold, who answered questions with single syllables, who could sit across a dinner table and be so thoroughly absent that Elena sometimes found herself speaking more carefully, weighing words before she said them, making herself small in increments so gradual she didn't notice the change until she caught herself apologizing for the sound of her own laughter at a dinner party. By the 5th year, she had grown very careful around him. On the surface, the house looked fine. They cooked together on Sunday evenings, a habit preserved from earlier years like a photograph, kept long after the feelings attached to it had shifted into something more complicated. Nathan grilled. Elena made sides. They shared a glass of wine on the back porch if the weather was reasonable, talked about work, about the neighbors, about the kinds of things that fill the space where deeper conversation has stopped growing. Nathan was not unkind during these evenings. He was present, attentive even, and there were moments, his hand brushing hers as she reached for the wine, the way he still looked at her sometimes when she wasn't performing for anyone, where the original thing between them surfaced briefly like something rising through deep water. That the mornings were harder. Nathan woke with a particular tension in his jaw that he had started carrying into breakfast, into responses to ordinary questions about schedules and grocery lists. Elena had learned to read the set of his shoulders from across the kitchen as a kind of weather report. Some mornings were open and some mornings were closed, and she had stopped asking which before she knew, because the asking itself seemed to determine the answer. Serena Clark had been Elena's closest friend since graduate school, a woman with a direct, unhurried quality that Nathan had always found mildly unreadable. She appeared in the margins of their life regularly, dinner every few weeks, occasional weekend plans, the kind of friendship that continued steadily without requiring much maintenance. Nathan had no real feelings about Serena one way or another. She was simply part of Elena's life, in the way that certain furniture is simply part of a room. It was a Wednesday evening in late September when the pattern began, though Nathan wouldn't identify it as a pattern until much later. Elena came home from work, changed out of her blazer, and appeared in the kitchen doorway with her bag still over her shoulder. "I'm having dinner with Serena," she said. "I won't be too late." "Okay," Nathan said without looking up from the cutting board. She left. He ate alone, watched television for an hour, went to bed before she returned. When she came in at 10:30, he was facing the wall and she moved through the room quietly and neither of them said anything. In the morning, the moment felt so ordinary that Nathan would not have been able to say, if asked, whether it had even happened. He would remember it later. He would remember every one of them. By November, Elena was going out 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. The pattern had assembled itself so gradually that Nathan had not noticed the architecture of it until he was already inside it, until he was eating dinner alone more often than not, until the evenings had a different texture, quieter and somehow larger, the house taking on the particular quality of a space that has been arranged for one person rather than 2. He told himself at first that this was fine. Elena had a full life. She had always had friends, interests, dimensions beyond a marriage. He had respected that, had even loved it about her in the early years. The way she moved through the world with a completeness that didn't require him to be everything. He repeated this to himself with some frequency in October and less frequency in November, and by December he had mostly stopped, because the logic had begun to feel like a thing he was performing rather than believing. What replaced it was quieter and worse, a low, persistent conviction that she was drifting, that the frequency of her absence was a form of communication, a translation of something she had decided not to say out loud. He did not confront her. This was important to understand about Nathan. Not that he avoided conflict exactly, but that his particular relationship with anger meant that he had no reliable access to the middle register. There was the cold containment and there was the eruption, and in his experience the eruption never produced anything worth the damage. So he had built a very efficient system of suppression that had, over years, quietly narrowed his emotional vocabulary to something functional but thin. He could not say "I feel abandoned" without it becoming something else in his throat. So he said nothing. Instead, he receded. Elena noticed. Of course she noticed. She had spent 4 years learning to read him, and the shift in his temperature was detectable to her, the way a change in barometric pressure is detectable to someone whose knees have learned to read weather. She watched him become more formal at breakfast, more careful with his words, more likely to answer her questions with a completeness that somehow managed to foreclose follow-up. He was not hostile, he was simply sealed. One Thursday in December, she came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and his laptop working, and she set her bag down and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and he did not look up. "How was your evening?" he asked, still looking at the screen. "Good," she said. "We talked for a long time." "Right," he said. She waited. He scrolled something on the screen. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the sink and looked at him, and he did not offer anything further. "You seem tired," she said. "I'm fine." She went upstairs. Nathan sat with his whiskey and his laptop for another 40 minutes, then closed everything and stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the dark backyard, at the patio furniture they had bought together in the spring and hadn't put away before the cold came. He had started in the previous 2 weeks, doing something he was not entirely comfortable acknowledging, even to himself. When Elena went out, he found himself checking the time she left and the time she returned, not writing it down. He wasn't a man who wrote things down, but holding the information, cataloging it with the quiet precision of someone building a case he didn't yet know how to use. She left at 7:15 on Tuesdays, 7:30 on Thursdays. She returned between 10 and 10:45, reliably. She always looked, when she came home, not disheveled or secretive, but somehow settled, which bothered him in a way he found difficult to parse. Not guilty, not evasive, simply quieter, as though something in her had been reorganized. He had not looked at her phone. He wanted it noted in whatever internal record he was keeping, that he had not looked at her phone. In January, he ran into Serena Clark at a coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. This was not unusual in itself. They lived in the same neighborhood, had been in the same social orbit for 5 years. She was at a corner table with a book and a flat white, and she looked up when he came in and gave him the same direct, unhurried smile she had always given him. "Nathan," she said. "How are you?" "Good," he said. "Fine." And then, because it was the thing a person asked, "You?" "Really well, actually," she said. Something in the specificity of actually registered at the edges of his attention, but he was already moving toward the counter, already ordering. He did not sit with her. He took his coffee and left, and in the car he turned the word over Sue and "actually" and placed it beside the other pieces he was holding, not knowing yet what picture they were forming. That evening, Elena said she was going to Serena's. "Tell her I said hi," Nathan said. He watched Elena's face carefully. Something crossed it, grief, unreadable, and then she said, "I will," and picked up her bag. After she left, Nathan sat in the silence of the house and felt the specific loneliness of a person who has begun to understand that they have misread something, but cannot yet see what the correct reading is. He opened his laptop, closed it, poured a glass of water and didn't drink it. He thought about the coffee shop, about the word "actually," about the settled look on Elena's face when she came home. He picked up his phone. "I don't know," he said quietly to no one, to the empty kitchen, to whatever attentive silence had been accumulating in the corners of the room. "Maybe, like, follow this story or something." He set the phone down and looked at it. "I don't know why I said that." The house didn't answer. The quiet resumed. He sat there for a long time, and what he felt was not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. The exhausting, humiliating sensation of being the last person in a room to understand the conversation. The confrontation, if it could be called that, happened on a Friday in February. Elena had come home at 10:20, hung her coat on the hook by the door, with the particular care of someone who needed a moment to compose herself before entering the larger space of the house. Nathan was in the living room. He had not turned the television on. He was sitting in the chair by the window, a book open on his knee that he had not been reading, and the lamp was on. And the room had the quality of a scene that had been arranged for a conversation neither of them had scheduled. She stopped in the doorway, looked at him. "You're up," she said. "I am." She set her bag on the couch and sat on the far end of it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The house made its small sounds. The refrigerator, the heat cycling on. "Nathan," she said, "why are you so cold to me?" The question was not accusatory. That was the thing he had not expected. She asked it the way a person asks about something they have been trying to understand for a long time, with a weariness that suggested the question had been forming for months. Her voice was level. Her hands were folded in her lap. Nathan looked at her. He reached beside the chair to the end table and picked up an envelope. He leaned forward and placed it on the cushion between them. She looked at it, looked at him. "What is this?" "Open it." She did. Inside were several printed pages, not photographs exactly, but records, printed emails from her account that she had left open on the shared laptop in September, when the pattern was just beginning. He had not been snooping, or had not intended to. He had opened the laptop to check a work document and the inbox had been there, and he had read the subject lines before he understood what he was reading. And then he had read further. The emails were between Elena and Serena Clark. Appointment confirmations, session recaps, notes on behavioral patterns. The language was careful and professional, and it had taken Nathan several readings over several evenings before the full shape of it became clear to him. Serena Clark was not only Elena's friend, she had her master's in clinical psychology. She maintained a small private practice, and for the past 5 months, Elena had been meeting with her twice weekly, not for girls' nights or dinners, but for sessions. Guided conversations about the marriage, about Nathan's anger, its patterns, its escalations, the way it had been narrowing the space Elena occupied in their shared life. Elena stared at the pages. Her hands, he noticed, had gone very still. You knew, she said, for a while. How long? December. She was quiet. He watched her work through it. The particular recalibration of a person who has been operating on assumptions that have just been revised. When she looked up, her face was not angry. It was something more complicated than that. I was trying to help, she said. I didn't want to. I didn't think you would respond well to being told directly. You are probably right, Nathan said. That's not. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I wasn't doing it behind your back because I was ashamed of you, Nathan. I was doing it because I didn't know how else to reach you. He nodded slowly. And what did Serena tell you? He asked. In 5 months of sessions, Elena folded the pages carefully, set them on the cushion. That I've been managing you, she said. That I've been so focused on not triggering the anger that I stopped saying what I actually needed. That both of us have been doing versions of the same thing, making ourselves smaller to avoid something uncomfortable. The heat cycled off. The house was very quiet. She also said, Elena continued, and her voice shifted slightly, became more careful. That she thought you might already know. That people like you, people who've built that kind of containment, often know more than they let on. Nathan looked at his hands. People like me, he said. I didn't mean it as an insult. I know. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the particular silence of two people who have just said true things and are now sitting with the weight of them, not yet knowing what comes next. What do you want to do? Nathan asked. Elena looked at him for a long moment. I don't know, she said honestly. What do you want to do? He didn't answer. Not because he was being cold, but because he genuinely didn't know yet, and for the first time in a long time he was unwilling to replace uncertainty with a performance of certainty. He sat with it. She let him. When she went upstairs, he stayed in the chair for another hour, the lamp on, the envelope on the cushion beside him, the house making its small, reliable sounds around the large pile, unresolved thing they had placed between them. Spring arrived without resolution, which is how most things actually arrive. They did not separate. They did not, in the weeks after February, have the transformative conversation that Nathan had half expected and half dreaded. The one where everything would be examined and named and either repaired or ended. Life, as it tends to, continued. Nathan went to work. Elena went to work. They shared Sunday dinners with the new coffee maker between them, and the conversations were different. Not easier exactly, but more honest in the specific way that honesty feels when it has replaced performance rather than added to it. Elena continued her sessions with Serena. This was acknowledged now out loud, a fact occupying the same neutral domestic space as grocery lists and oil changes. Nathan did not ask for details. Serena's name moved through the house the same way it always had, with the difference that it now carried a different weight for both of them. The weight of a thing that had been secret and was no longer. What shifted most significantly in the months that followed was Nathan's relationship with his own interior. He had agreed in March to see someone himself. Not Serena, a man named Dr. Paul Hartwell, referred by his GP, whose office was in a building downtown with uncomfortable chairs and a white noise machine outside the door. Nathan had gone to the first appointment prepared to perform self-awareness, to demonstrate that he understood his patterns, that he had insight into the anger, that he was the kind of person who could acknowledge a problem without being made genuinely vulnerable by that acknowledgement. Dr. Hartwell had been patient and unhurried in a way that made this strategy difficult to maintain. By the 4th session, Nathan had said something he had not said out loud before, that he had been afraid for most of their marriage, that Elena would eventually decide he wasn't worth the difficulty, that the coldness, the withdrawal, the sealed-off quality she had been trying to address without his knowledge was not cruelty but protection, a preemptive management of an abandonment he was constantly anticipating. He had sat with that for the rest of the session and most of the drive home. Elena, for her own part, was doing her own revising. She had told her narrative, to Serena, to herself, and occasionally to a friend in another city named Margaret, who knew only the broad strokes, as a story about patience, about a woman who had loved her husband wisely enough to seek help for him without damaging his ego. This narrative was not false exactly, but it was incomplete in ways that her sessions with Serena were slowly making visible. She had not gone to Serena purely out of love. She had gone because she was exhausted and frightened and unwilling to have a direct conversation that might confirm the thing she feared most. That Nathan's anger was not a problem to be solved, but a fundamental incompatibility, and that acknowledging it directly would force a decision she wasn't ready to make. She had, in other words, been managing her own fear under the cover of managing his behavior. That's not the same as deceit, Serena told her in May, in the specific professional tone that was also the tone of a friend who loves you enough not to let you off the hook, but it's worth knowing which it was. Elena had driven home from that session in silence without music, which she rarely did. The summer was warm and slow. They went to a friend's wedding in June and danced, which they hadn't done in years. And Nathan held her with a looseness that was different from his usual controlled closeness. Not abandoned exactly, but less managed. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Some things are better received in silence. In August, they took a week in a rented house on the coast of Maine. Just the two of them, and what happened there was not a reconciliation in the clean sense of the word. It was messier and quieter than that. They argued once, on a rainy Tuesday, about something small that was not actually about the small thing, and Nathan did not go cold. He stayed in it. His voice rose slightly, and then he caught it rising and said, flatly, "I'm doing the thing." And Elena had looked at him with something she hadn't felt in a long time, something she recognized only after a moment as respect. They walked on the beach that evening in the early dark, and the argument was not resolved so much as metabolized, taken in, processed, allowed to pass through without leaving the usual damage. On the last night of the trip, lying in the dark in the rented bedroom with the sound of the ocean through the open window, Elena said, "I should have told you." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't available to be told," he said. "Both things can be true." "Yes," he said, "they can." The envelope was still in the drawer of the end table by the living room chair. Nathan found it in October, on a Saturday morning when Elena was out, at a session with Serena, as she was most Saturday mornings now, though she had reduced to once a week, and Nathan had begun to think of that hour as a kind of maintenance, the same way he thought of his own appointments with Hartwell, which had become something he no longer dreaded and did not yet know how to describe as something he looked forward to. He sat down in the chair with the envelope in his hand and opened it. Read the pages. They were the same pages, the appointment confirmations, the session notes, the careful professional language through which Elena had been trying, from a remove of 5 months, to do something that love had made difficult to do directly. He had known, reading them the first time, that the knowledge would change something. He had not known which thing. What it had actually changed was harder to name than he'd expected. It had not made him trust her more exactly. It had made him understand, with a precision that was not comfortable, the specific shape of her fear, that she had loved him in the way that people love things they believe are fragile, with a carefulness that over time becomes its own kind of distance. She had not been trying to deceive him. She had been trying to protect him from the knowledge that she found him difficult to live with. He sat with the pages for a while. The thing that stayed with him, sitting in that chair on that October morning, was not the anger he might have expected to feel. Not at her choices. Not at the months of managed silence. It was something quieter, a recognition. He had spent 4 years making himself hard to reach, and then, in the privacy of his own chest, resenting the distance. Elena had spent 4 years accommodating that hardness, and then seeking help from someone else rather than asking him to be reachable. They had both been, in their own ways, very efficient at maintaining a problem while believing themselves to be addressing it. The front door opened. Elena came in with her jacket over her arm, her cheeks slightly flushed from the cool air. She stopped when she saw him in the chair with the pages. "I was looking for something in the drawer," he said. She nodded. She sat down on the couch. Not the far end, but not beside him either. The middle. She looked at the envelope in his hands. "Are you okay?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which had become, in the past several months, something he was relearning how to do, not performing consideration. actually taking the measure of what he felt before he answered. I think so, he said. I was thinking about something Hartwell said, about how most of what we call distance is actually proximity to fear. Elena looked at him. That's almost a bumper sticker. He would hate that characterization. Probably. The quiet that followed was different from the quiet of February. That quiet had been the silence of two people holding back. This one was the silence of two people who had, over a year of incremental and sometimes painful honesty, learned to sit together without filling the space with performance. Nathan set the envelope on the end table. I want to ask you something, he said. Okay. When you were in those sessions, in the beginning, the ones you weren't telling me about, what did you actually think was going to happen? Best case. Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, at the light coming through, at the ordinary October afternoon outside. I thought, she said slowly, that Serena would help me find the right words. The exact right words that would reach you without triggering the withdrawal. I thought it was a language problem, essentially, that I just hadn't learned the right dialect yet. And now, she looked at him. Now I think there isn't a language for it. I think I was trying to find a way to need less courage. Nathan absorbed this. He thought about the night in February, the envelope on the cushion between them, the way she had looked, not guilty, but exhausted. He thought about Maine, about the argument and what it had cost him to stay in it, about the drawer where the envelope had been sitting for 8 months, available to either of them, unmentioned. We've both been doing that, he said, trying to need less courage. Yes. He reached over and picked up the envelope, considered it once more. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, and placed it in the recycling bin under the sink. He stood for a moment with his hand on the counter, looking at the backsplash, at the small ordinary details of the kitchen they shared. When he came back to the living room, Elena was still on the couch. She looked at him with an expression he had learned over the past year to read more accurately. Not warmth exactly, not the performed warmth of earlier years, but something that had survived a more rigorous test, something that knew him and had stayed. He sat down beside her, not far, not close enough to make a statement, just beside. Outside, the leaves were doing what they did every October, which was turn and fall and make the neighborhood look briefly like a painting of itself. The coffee maker on the counter was the new one, the replacement. It had been there for over a year now. Ordinary and unremarkable, the way that most repairs eventually become. They sat together in the quiet of the house. There was no resolution, precisely. There was this: two people who had each, in their own way, confused management with love, and who were, slowly and without guarantee, learning the difference. There was a marriage that had not ended, which was not the same as a marriage that was healed, but was not nothing. There was a man who was learning to stay in rooms when they became uncomfortable, and a woman who was learning that some things cannot be fixed from the outside, only entered. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Neither of them spoke for a long time, and neither of them needed to, and that, the fact of that, was itself a kind of answer to the question they had both been asking, in different languages, for years. Some silences are empty. Some are full of everything that finally doesn't need to be said.